Hi friends, my name's host Eric. I'm the host of Talking with Famous People, and I'm here with my beloved girlfriend and fellow host of Talking with Famous People, Rachel. Today we're going to be discussing how to tell apart INFJ and INFP.
Talking with famous people.
Okay, so let's look at NI first, the demonstrative function for the INFP and the dominant function for the INFJ. So a simple question then is going to be, what's the best way to differentiate between those two? Well, first of all, NI in the sixth slot is countervalued, which means the INFP doesn't use it for themselves, so to speak. It doesn't like it for themselves. But it's also demonstrative, which means if you're trying to evoke NI from an INFP, you'll probably get it no problem. If you say to an INFP, oh, I don't know about this job I'm at, whatever, they'll tell you perhaps, well, maybe it's just not the right job for you. INFJ, if you tell an INFJ, I'm complaining about my job, blah, 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 the INFJ also will say, well, maybe it's just not the right job for you. Here's the difference. If the INFJ is complaining to you about their job, my job, and you say to the INFJ, maybe it's just not the right job for you, they'll say, yeah, you're probably right. Whereas if you say it to the INFP, they'll say, yeah, but, and list a bunch of reasons why that singular answer is not adequate. It's a lot more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm. My INFP friend, I gave her these oracle cards that she loved and be like, I'm going to read your cards for you. She was that person. So it was demonstrative. She was demonstrating, hey, I can do this.
He asked an INFP and an INFJ their position on something general, such as when they conflict, what do you prioritize? Being considerate of another person's feelings, or making sure that fairness is upheld? Well, an INFP will consistently ask for examples and will probably defer to, well, it's hard to say if I weren't actually in the moment. Because, of course, they're using their FI, how they feel about something, plus their NE, various possible ways in which a given generalization could play out in the specific as a tool function. This prevents them from feeling comfortable answering questions about generics like that with a general answer, because they don't believe that one can know generally what you ought to do meaningfully. You have to instead deal with a particular every time. They're primarily a particularist type.
Even though I'm dominant NI and I love tarot, like I'm still shy using my dominant function as a business. I'm uncomfortable with it. I like to do it with you. I like to do it on live stream because I'm very comfortable there. But when it comes to like having my own channel with it, I think an INFP may be more prone to demonstrating that than an INFJ, even though INFJ may be more natural with it.
For the average person, you may see a clear displays of what you perceive as examples of the sixth slot function from somebody, even to the extent that it may be up front and center to a certain extent. But what you're not going to see is them being receptive to it, applying it to their own life. You're going to see, in fact, when you call upon it regarding them and their identity, that they're going to respond very differently. Like I indicated, if you ask them, will you in general prioritize being fair or being merciful, they're not going to want to give you an answer to that. They're going to want a lot of specifics, whereas INFJs are much more comfortable with giving an answer to that. So that's another way to determine between NI1 and NI6.
Talking.
TI for the INFJ is in the third slot function, and in the INFP is the eighth slot. Now, the thing to remember here is there's an additional factor which is not listed here on this chart, but which is absolute or instrumental value. TI in the third slot for the INFJ is an absolute value, whereas TI in the eighth slot for the INFP is an instrumental value. And that's significant because it's a challenge in general for us to distinguish between eighth slot and third slot TI on a test, as we normally might distinguish TI. So if I give you deductive reasoning test eighth slot and third slot is likely to test out about equivalently. So it's not a good way to check. Instead, you're going to have to check with corresponding values. It's not as determinate, it's not as certain, but it's more reliable in this instance than trying to distinguish between subtly different eighth and third slot ability levels. So I would say for the INFJ, you're going to look to see an absolute value of fairness. So you can think of the third slot function as a function in which if you might say, well, as long as I've got this taken care of, ultimately everything's going to be fine. So for the INFJ, that means as long as I've got fairness going on in my life, then I'll work it out. Everything's going to be fine.
If there's not enough fairness in what I believe should be fair, that's when I explode. That's when I unleash, maybe a door slam.
Now, in contrast, in the eighth slot, you've got a function that is in service of the dominant, fundamentally. When functioning healthily, you're operating with your 1, 2, and it's consistent with your scorecard of 3, which is to say you don't violate any acceptability standards on 3. And if you're trying to distinguish between the two, then you need to distinguish between whether it's an absolute value or an instrumental value. For INFPs, they use TI to justify things that are determined with their FI. This is my position that I hold on things because that's how I feel strongly about, and logic is how I establish that I not only am right about it for me, but that I'm right about it for you too. In contrast, INFJ views it more as a value to uphold. Whatever their NI is, if it's going to be FE'd properly, then it can't be inconsistent with TI too much. They've got to have some sort of qualifying statements to make it TI acceptable, or else ultimately they don't feel like they're safe.
Yeah.
They're not safe relying on FE that isn't supported with TI.
Right.
And if an environment is extremely fair to them, then they feel safe and can be more in their 1, 2, 8, like I was saying before. If they don't feel safe, then they're going to retreat to their 4th and be more dewy until they do feel safe.
When I was a child, my sister and it was just us for a while, and I made sure that just because she was the baby, that she didn't get more presents than me. That if we were celebrating Christmas or Easter or anywhere that there were like birthdays, that we got the same amount. Oh, if it wasn't fair, you weren't getting the FE that you wanted from me. It was not happening.
The thing is, not getting positive FE is one half of that equation. Remember, there's a carrot as far as FE goes. There's also the stick.
Yeah.
The stick is, if you're a little kid, I imagine, a tantrum and such.
Maybe a tantrum.
Because it's not fair.
Yep.
For INFP, in contrast, TI is something that is implicitly throwawayable if it's not needed for their first slot function. So for INFPs, it's what they authentically feel is significant to them is something they have to defend periodically with TI. But if they don't need to defend it, they're happy to jettison TI entirely and spend the time with their FI, NE, and third slot SI, which we'll get to. Right, so this is a tough one to distinguish between them. Yeah. Basically, the long and short of it, I would recommend that you use a different approach besides TI to distinguish between INFP and INFJ.
With famous people.
FE tool versus FE ignoring. Now, if you understand things in terms of a strength or weakness framework, which is probably ill-advised in general, but if you were to understand it as such, you might say that these two have kind of equivalent strength. In fact, it's even the case generally that the 5th slot function person views the tool slot function person as using it in somewhat of a clumsy fashion. And in this case, the INFP would find the tool function use of the FE by the INFJ a little ham-fisted. Concurrently, the INFJ would probably conclude that the INFP is failing to apply FE in circumstances that clearly require it, or that would benefit from it at least. So how do you tell those two apart?
I've been in work situations with INFPs, and I got along with everyone, so I made a lot of friends there, acquaintances. The INFP did not. We went to school together, so she was more attached to me. She would always, come to my desk all the time when I was clearly busy. Look, so-and-so, I'm very busy right now. I don't mean to be brushing you off, but I have work to do. I need to do my job. And all of a sudden she burst into tears, and I was like, oh my gosh, I feel so bad. I didn't mean to make her cry. But it never really dawned on her.
Well, I mean, the key thing about ignoring FE is it stems from dominant FI. If you know very clearly what you want and what feels most comfortable to you, it's generally going to be consistent with what other people think is acceptable too. So, for example, an FI person will generally err on the side of being kind or avoiding hurting people's feelings with FI in the dominant slot.
Yep.
But there are instances where maybe circumstances call for calling somebody out, right?
Yeah.
And they're going to ignore the FE realities here. This person needs to be checked because they're too big for their britches or something.
Yes.
It's not something that will occur to the FI Dom, who's assuming that everybody's feeling as strongly as they are.
Yes.
So there's equivalence, of course, the other direction as well. I'm not trying to say,
No.
that's a worse way to be.
No, not at all. And
So I don't know how useful this is to distinguishing between the two, but I've noticed that one way that FE ignoring manifests in the INFP is that when I'm done typing them, they don't give me any clear indication of whether they're pleased with my typing, displeased with my typing, agree with it, disagree with it. They don't feel any need for me to know how they have concluded about something because their conclusion methodology, FI, is subjective and particularist. So that's another sort of way to check is, do they do this? This is the one we originally came up with. Do they do this? Do they check to make sure that you have not misinterpreted something in advance? For example,
yes.
FE users will often say, I hope you don't think I meant mia.
Correct.
INFP will rarely say that or things like that. You'll have to probably make it clear to them that you do think they said mia before they're going to say something like that. INFJs will play proactive defense. If they say something they realize it could have been interpreted to mean mia, it's better to err on the side of caution and say, I hope you didn't think I meant mia because of two reasons from the INFJ's perspective.
Yes.
One being that if it was misinterpreted, you're safe then, and you don't have this miscommunication that needed to be cleared up that's for lingering. But two, even if you're wrong, erring on the side of caution in that fashion demonstrates that you're a team player and have goodwill.
Oh my gosh, totally.
I think that's good for FE 2 versus 5.
Talking.
Now on to SE. SE fourth versus SE polar. The INFJ has fourth slot or inferior SE, which is the subjective action function. And the INFP has seventh slot or polar SE, which is the subjective action function. So how do you distinguish between those? Obviously, inferior is going to be a function that is not obvious in the affect of the person. The dominant and the fourth are going to be kind of inversely proportional. Because you use the dominant so much, you rely on the fourth very little. So you're not going to see a lot of successfully executed SE out of an INFJ necessarily. They're not going to be the most follow through on project ideas people ever, but they're going to have a lot more awareness of what it is and how it plays out than is the INFP, who's got it polar. Polar mistakes extroverted sensing for something else all the time. If you tell an INFP to execute some tasks, they will say, okay, I'll write you an email asking you questions about it. If you say, look, the problem here is you just need to do the legwork, they'll say, I need to figure out better ordinality. No, that's T, that's not SE,
INFPs that I knew. Okay, so like one of them, she's like, let's go to this kimchi place. I'm like, cool. She's like, it's in Brooklyn. We'll go there. Well, she failed to tell me that she hadn't ever been there before, and she didn't know really where we were going. Even though we were like lost in Brooklyn, she just thought that like I would know like the way. I don't know why. It took 4 hours walking in Brooklyn in these parts that I had never been to before. She had never been to before. And then she tells me, she admits that halfway through, oh, I don't know where this place is. And I'm like,
And this is an INFP?
yeah.
Okay, so was she the one who initiated going to this place?
Yeah, she wanted to do something nice for me because she knew that I was going through like a tough time.
But she misunderstood what was required of action, I guess.
Yeah.
When feeling wounded, troubled, traumatized, or whatever, we'll go do some sort of SE thing.
Yep.
Like stride off and walk around the block and so forth. That's what the INFP will do some sort of TE thing, which is different, you know. It might look similar, but in other words, INFP is likely to figure out how to get into a email account they've not gotten into for a long time because they've not wanted to figure out how to reset the password and stuff, right? If you already know what to do and you're not doing it, it's an SE failure. If you need to figure out still what to do and you don't want to figure it out, it's a TE failure. For INFP, that would probably be how they react to feeling traumatized, put upon, etc. is figure out something they've been putting off because they have to figure it out. TE fourth is when they're feeling traumatized and put upon as such, then they're willing to accept and follow instructions.
Yes.
Talking with famous people.